So this morning is Father's Day, and I want to tell you this morning a real-life story about a man and a group of people that he led that we kind of read about in the Old Testament. The Old Testament is kind of the first section of the Bible. It kind of gives us details of the life of God's chosen people before the birth and the death and the resurrection of Jesus. And I want to just give you a little bit of a story, an overview of the life and times of a guy called Joshua that we read in the Old Testament and the people of God, the Israelites, that he led. And just to kind of give you a little bit of a background, okay, Moses, at the age of 120, decides that it's time to retire. I mean, I'm probably looking at retiring in my 70s in our generation. 120, that's a good innings. And what he does is he kind of gets Joshua and he lays hands on him in front of all the people in Israel, and he names Joshua as his successor. And Joshua's got some big shoes to fill, okay? Because just after he kind of lays hands on Joshua, we read that it says, "No one has ever shown the mighty power or performed the awesome deeds that Moses did in the sight of Israel." And you think, wow, that's some big shoes to fill right there. Imagine, you got a promotion at work and you're invited to the kind of retirement do of the guy that's roles you're just about to fill, and everyone's mingling around with a glass of wine or something, and they come up and say, "Hey, he was just such an awesome leader. He was an amazing boss. I don't think we've ever had a boss like him. He just took our company to a completely different level." Anyway, I'm really looking forward to working with you. It's going to be great. And it could be pretty intimidating, I suppose, because Moses is an amazing man. He's the guy that God used to lead the Israelite people out of slavery in Egypt. He's the guy that when he held up his staff, God used him to kind of part the waters of the Red Sea, and the Israelites fled from the pursuing Egyptian army. He's the guy that went up the mountain and God spoke with him and gave him a whole bunch of laws, the 10 Commandments, things that he wanted his people to live by. Moses is the guy that's led the Israelite people for like 40 years wandering around in the wilderness. And we're not talking about like a small bunch of people that he was responsible for leading. Towards the end of the kind of 40 years, you can read about it in the Bible, there's this census that is done, and it says the number of men over the age of 20 was 601,730. Well, that's a lot of people, and that doesn't include like women and young people and children. They reckon that Moses was leading a crowd of people that numbered around about 2 million people. And all that Moses has been carrying with the help of God, he now passes on to Joshua. Now that kind of responsibility could be pretty crippling had it not been for the fact that when Moses lays hands on Joshua, we read that it says that Joshua was filled with the spirit of wisdom. In other words, at that moment, the Holy Spirit, God's presence, came and rested on Joshua. And I want to kind of pick up the story of what happens next from the beginning of the book of Joshua. If you've got it, have a little look. But we're going to be kind of doing a bit of an overview this morning. Maybe we will do an overflow. So I'm going to start from the beginning of Joshua's, and we kind of read this. "Moses, my servant, is dead. Now then, you and all these people get ready to cross the river Jordan into the land I'm about to give them, to the Israelites. I will give you every place where you set your feet. As I promised Moses, your territory will extend from the desert of Lebanon and from the great river, the Euphrates, all the Hittite country to the Mediterranean Sea in the west. No one will be able to stand against you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will never leave you or forsake you. Be strong and courageous, because you will lead these people to inherit the land I swore to their ancestors to give them." I mean, what an amazing promise. God gives Joshua at the start of his time leading the Israelites. Moses is dead, but the promises of God are still alive. Just as Moses had an exciting adventure so you too, as well, Joshua, have an exciting adventure. And the scale of that adventure is huge. The kind of detail of the land that God has just told Joshua that they're going to go and inherit kind of equates to about 60,000 square miles. You know, to give you an idea of how big that is, it's just a fraction bigger than the size of England and Wales put together. That's what they're looking at. That's what they're looking at. After 40 years of being like a nomadic people wandering around, they are just a river away from inheriting the promises of God. And Joshua kind of gives orders to his officials to go throughout the camp and tell all the people to get themselves ready, because he says in 3 days we're going to cross the river Jordan into the land that God's promised us. And he kind of sends 2 spies out to just kind of check out the land to see kind of what's happening. And the spies come back and they say, the Lord has surely given the whole of the land into our hands. All the people are melting in fear because of us. And what you notice as you read through the text is that Joshua might be the man leading the people on the adventure, but there's other people on the adventure as well. You know, he's got like a band of brothers. He's got like officials and spies. They're on the adventure as well. But it doesn't just stop there, because it says that all the people, all 2 million of the people are going to get caught up in the adventures of God. Everyone gets to witness what God is going to do firsthand. That's what stands out for me. You know, sometimes we think, you know, God's got exciting plans and adventures for some people, but not for others. But what we read here is that the entire nation is going to get caught up in the adventure. Not one of them is going to be left behind. The instruction is to take all of them on the adventure, to all of them to go across the river into the promised land. And after 3 days, the officials went throughout the camp and told everyone that when they see the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant, that's kind of like the box that is holding the 10 Commandments and the laws that God gave Moses. They say when you see the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant, they say you just kind of tuck in behind them and you follow them. And then Joshua, he stands up in front of all the people and he says, get yourself ready. He says, because tomorrow God is going to do amazing things amongst you. And there must have been like real excitement in the camp. I mean, what's he going to do? You know, could it be that the things that we've been kind of telling our kids about the time when we crossed the Red Sea, that it's going to happen again in their time? They're going to witness these amazing things that God is doing. And early the next day, the priests, you know, they carry the Ark of the Covenant towards the river, we're told. And there's no way of them getting across it. And what you don't read is that they kind of come up to the river Jordan and they put the ark down and they have a little look at it and they have a conversation about, well, you know, how are we going to get across there? That's not what we read. It says, as their feet touched the water's edge. So you get this impression that, you know, their steps don't seem to falter. They're carrying the Ark of the Covenant towards the river Jordan, and it's getting closer, getting closer, and all of a sudden, their feet are touching the water. They're in it. I mean, you don't get the impression they intend to stop walking. I mean, what on earth are they believing is going to happen? I mean, seriously, what are they thinking is going to happen? I'll tell you what they believe is going to happen. They're believing that God is going to do amazing things amongst them. And what you see as their feet touch the water is a group of people that have faith that God can do the impossible. And where does that faith come from? That faith comes from them seeing and hearing of who God is. They've seen it in the past. Some of them might have seen it in the past. They've seen God do the impossible. So when they get to the river, they're just going to keep walking because they've seen it before. Or maybe they've heard it before. Maybe their parents told them. They've told them of the incredible crossing of the Red Sea. And so when they get there, you know, they're just going to keep going. They've seen it before. These men carrying the ark have seen and heard about God, and they're able to trust him now for the impossible. And as their feet touched the water's edge, the water from upstream, we're told, this is what it says, the water from upstream stops flowing and it piles up in a heap. And the priests who carried the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord stopped in the middle of the Jordan and stood on dry ground. And all Israel passed by until the whole nation, every single one of them, 2 million or so of them, had completed the crossing on dry land. And God's done it again, just like he did in the time of Moses, and the entire nation gets caught up on the adventure. They all witness firsthand, not just like the power of God, but the fact that God keeps his promises, that he's with them as a people, and they all get to witness it. And when all the people get to the other side of the Jordan, what we're told is that God says to Joshua, I want you to take 12 men, okay, one from like each of the tribes of Israel, and I want you to send them back down into the river, into the middle where the priests are still standing in the middle of the Jordan. And I want them to kind of pick up a stone each and bring it out of the river and stack it up as a pile of stones on the edge. And so off they do, and they go and do that, and they bring them up and they stack up the piles. And the pile of stones is meant to act as a memorial to what God has done. And Joshua says to the people, in the future, your descendants will ask their parents, what do these stones mean? Tell them Israel crossed the Jordan on dry land. It's a way of God saying, you know what happens here must be remembered and retold. These adventures that you're having are not just for you. God wants the details of his provision and his power to be passed on to the next generation. So these stories of stacked up stones will be told. What happened there? You know, so maybe a day comes where a dad is kind of walking past a pile of stones with his son, and his son says to his dad, hey dad, what's that pile there for? And his dad can say, oh son, let me tell you about that particular adventure that we had with God. Let me tell you about what happened on that day. That's what the stack of stones is there for. Because faith comes from hearing. And so passing on the extraordinary deeds of God was and is essential. And the Israelites have kind of crossed the river, and after being a nomadic people for 40 years, they're standing on the banks of the river staring at the beginnings of like new territories that God has promised will be their home. It's an amazing moment. You see, for the last 40 years, as they've been wandering around, God has he's fed them supernaturally. Every day, you know, they've been out and God has given them something called manna. It's like this stuff that they would have to go out every day and pick it all up and make it into this kind of sweet bread. That's what they did every day. They had this manna bread that God supplied. And now we're told that this moment happens where the manna stops. God stops providing the manna. And for the first time, these people start eating the produce of the land. I mean, there would have been hundreds of thousands of people that were born in the wilderness, that have grown up, and the only thing they've ever tasted is manna. You know, what's for breakfast, Mum? Manna. Okay. What's for lunch, Dad? Well, manna, but we're going to have a side order of manna with that. You know, that's all they would have eaten for their entire lives. And now you have a generation there that they're not just kind of seeing the goodness of God, they're literally tasting it. I mean, I don't think you'd forget things like that in a hurry. I mean, talking about tasting the goodness of God, I think it's time someone comes and joins these people over here. Okay, so look at your numbers for a minute, guys. Has anyone got number 13? 13? Jim, you promised me these were the right numbers. What about 14? There he goes. You see, it's just asleep. Enjoy yourself. Have you left them something? Yeah, there's something. Good. So, having crossed the River Jordan, Joshua leads the people into the land that God's promised them. And the only problem is the land that God's promised them is not going to just like empty territory. It's occupied land. So if they're going to kind of walk into the promises of God, they're going to have to go into battle. And the next season of their adventure that God calls the people on is battle. And the first city they come across that we're told is this city called Jericho. And they get to the city of Jericho, and like the walls are just huge, we're told. And God gives the Israelites, and God gives Joshua the battle plans. He says, what I want you to do is every day for 6 days, I want you and all the people just to kind of walk around the city, okay, once every day. And then on the 7th day, you're to walk around the city 7 times, and I want the priests to blow their trumpets. And as the priests blow their trumpets, I want all the people to shout. Doesn't say what they're meant to shout. Just like, shout, woo, you know. And as you go, woo, I mean, that's the most manly thing I've done on stage. Good job it happened on Father's Day. So as all the people shout, the walls are just going to come crashing down. I mean, that sounds bonkers, doesn't it? But these people have seen some crazy things. They've seen some amazing things. Some of them would have seen the Red Sea parted. All of them have seen the River Jordan parted. They've seen manna just appear every morning. So walking around the city and trusting God that something like that's going to happen, that's just an average day. So that's what they do. They walk around it and they shout in a more manly way than I did. And then the walls just come crashing down and they advance and they take hold of the city. And that's the first kind of city they take. And then what happens in the rest of the next section in the book of Joshua is like account after account of the people moving forward into the land that God's given them. It's like victory after victory, territory after territory. You know, their success is so great that in the end, the book of Joshua just stops recording every single detail of every battle, and it just gives you a massive long list of all the kings they've defeated. You know, the king of Jericho, the king of Ai, the king of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron. It goes on and on. I'm reading it this week and I'm thinking, I'm just going to count it. And I start counting and I get to the bottom and I realize, it's told us how many. It says there were 31 kings in total. Always read on. 31 kings in total. I mean, this generation are living in extraordinary times. And God's given them so much, but you also start to recognize that they're only beginning to scratch the surface of the adventure God has for them and all the things that He wants to give them. After so much advance and so many battles and so many kings defeated, God says to Joshua one day, He says, "You are now very old." I mean, that's rude. But He says, "You are now very old. And there's still very large areas of land still to be taken over." And you get the impression that although this generation is starting to age, God has got a lot more that He wants to do. A new generation needs to be raised up to continue to move forward into the promises of God. And God commands Joshua to kind of start dividing out the land and that they've taken. And to each tribe is given a section of the land. And that's exactly what Joshua does. And just like everyone got a part of the adventure, everyone gets a part of the inheritance. It's just like the stack of stones. The land becomes like a stack of stones. You know, every day as they wake up and they're to see the land that God's given them, it's to act as a reminder of the goodness of God, of all the things that He's done for them. And so He divides it up. After wandering around in the wilderness for 40 years, they get to have some of the land. And we're told they get to start enjoying the goodness of the land. They begin to settle and enjoy the promises of God. And Joshua at this point he is super old. And we read in Joshua chapter 23, it says this: "After a long time had passed, and the Lord had given Israel rest from all their enemies around them, Joshua, by now a very old man, summoned all Israel, their elders, leaders, judges, and officials. And he said to them, I am very old. You yourselves have seen everything the Lord your God has done to all these nations for your sake. It was the Lord your God who fought for you. And then he says, hold fast to the Lord your God as you have done until now. And then he carries on a little bit later and he says, now I am about to go to the way of all the earth. You know with all your heart and soul that not one of all the good promises the Lord your God gave you has failed. Every promise has been fulfilled. Not one of them has failed. And his old age, he wants to remind all the people, especially the leaders that have responsibility for the people, of all the battles they've been in, of the fact that God has given them rest, that he's given them an inheritance. But even though they're now resting and enjoying the land and starting to settle, he wants to remind them not to forget who God is, to hold fast onto who he is. You know, rest is a great thing. You know, we all need rest. It's a brilliant thing. But with rest can sometimes come this danger that we kind of loosen our grip on who God is. You know, when we're in a battle, when we're fighting and we're trying to take territory, we're very keen to hold on to God. We recognize we need him. But then when we start to settle and maybe get a bit comfortable and life gets a bit comfortable, it's easy just to kind of loosen our grip off God. I say, life is easy. I don't. And with that comes complacency, actually. And Joshua wants to say to the people, even though you're starting to rest, keep holding on to God. Keep trusting him. And after speaking to all the leaders, he then gathers up the whole of Israel, we're told, and he gets them all together, and he begins to recount their entire history. Not just like their recent history, their whole history. He starts with the time of Abraham, and then he talks about Isaac and Jacob and Moses, and when they left kind of Egypt and then crossed the Red Sea, and then he tells them about crossing the River Jordan and the battles, and he just tells them about all their history. And what you get a sense of is that he wants them not to remember what a great leader he is. He wants them to remember what a great God they've got. You know, we read in the Psalms, in Psalm 145, it says, like, one generation commends your works to the next. That's exactly what Joshua is doing here. He is commending to the next generation. He's going, guys, I just want to tell you who God is again. I'm just going to go again and recount to you the story so you can remember the goodness of God. I want to commend his works to you. That's what he's doing. That's what stories do. You know, we sang earlier in the song, I've heard 1,000 stories of what you're like. And that's what Joshua is doing. He's telling them stories. And then at the age of 110, after leading God's people through many adventures, Joshua dies. And we read that, it says this, that the people served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and of the elders who outlived him, and who had seen the great things the Lord had done. And this is amazing, Even though Joshua dies, and the people continue to serve God, because this generation knew who God was. They've seen the things he's done. They were on the adventure. Every day they woke up and they saw the land. It's like a reminder to them of the place that God has taken them from and the place that they've put him. It's a reminder to them of his faithfulness. And the result of knowing the faithfulness of God is that throughout their lives, just as Joshua had encouraged them to do, they held fast onto who God was, because they were the benefactors of God's incredible grace. And what God did in that generation was extraordinary. And I've given you a brief overview of what they experienced. And I'm thinking, man, I would have loved to have been alive then and seen some of the things that they've seen. It's incredible what they got to witness. But just as their story ends, another one begins. that is equally outstanding. And let me just read you what the next verse says. It says, after that whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors, another generation grew up who neither knew the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. I mean, for me, reading that, I think it's one of the most tragic things I've read in the Bible. I mean, we're not talking about, 200 years after the time of these people, a generation, 200 years later, that just didn't know God. No, we're talking about the next generation. And I'm thinking to myself, how on earth does that happen? How does that happen? It was simple, really. One generation, when their adventure had finished, they began to settle. They got comfortable. They knew who God was, but they forgot to pass it on to the next generation. That's all it took. It's pretty sobering, really. The psalmist said, each generation commends your works to the next. Basically, this generation, they just forgot to do that. They kept all the amazing things that God had done to themselves. And for those who know God, have seen the works of his hand, come the responsibility to pass it on to the next generation. If you're a Christian here this morning, your life following God is not a personal sprint to the finish line where you're going to see him in glory one day. Often we can reduce down our Christian lives to that. It becomes about our personal race, what's God's going to do in my life, what my future looks like, the promises that he has for me. And although we have the amazing privilege of having a personal walk with God, of course we do, and of course he's got things for you, but if we reduce our Christian lives just to us and what God's got for us and us getting to the finishing line, well, we've completely misunderstood what the Christian life is about. The Christian life is not a personal race to the finish line. The Christian life is more like a relay race where the baton gets passed on. Now, let me just show you what I mean for a minute. How much time we got? Okay. Let me just show you. If we can have the video up. Okay, so here we go. I'm going to show you a relay race. So off he goes. First guy's got the baton. Off he goes. He's running. He's super fast. All of them are super fast, to be fair. And then he sees the next person. He sees him. He's coming up. Look at them go. And then pause it when he passes, if you can. There. See that? It's amazing. So he gets the baton. And he's running towards the next person. Do you see, he's not just kind of running randomly. He's running with purpose. He sees the person in the distance. He's like, I'm heading towards you. It's not random. It's intentional. He's got him in his sights. And when he gets to him, he's so focused on him that he passes it on to him. He doesn't kind of throw it to him. He doesn't say, oh, sorry. Sorry about that. Missed it. Okay, and then just wander off. He doesn't do that. It's an intention. He stays focused and he puts it in his hands. And what you notice here is that he does not let it go until he knows the other person's got hold of it. There's a moment there where they're both holding it on together. You got it? You got it? He's got it. I'm going to let go. There's an intentionality about it. If you're a Christian here, that's what happened to you. That's why you're able to say, I've got faith in Jesus. I've got this amazing life that I lead. because God used someone to pass on the things that they've seen of God to you. That's the sort of pass that we're called to make to the next generation. It's not a throw that in the hope that they might get it. It's intentional. We're not made to take our hands off it until we're certain they've got it. And what you notice also in here is the person receiving the pass is not passive. Okay. The onus is on the person passing the baton to kind of, because he's not actually looking, but he's got his hand out like that. But he's not passive. He's not kind of wandering around like this, and the other guy's trying to can you just get hold of that, please? He's reaching back for it. The next generation, me, I want to reach back to the generation before me. I want to reach back for all that they've seen of God. All their wisdom. All their stories. I want to hear it. I want to spend time going, come on, give me some of those stories. Tell me some of the things you've seen. Often we can you have a tendency to look back and go, we got it now. I don't need you anymore. It's not how this thing works. So let's carry on the race. And what I want you to do is keep an eye on the guy in the kind of black and yellow. Off he goes. He's got a baton. He's going to pass it on to the next person. Usain Bolt, I think it is. And watch what he does. Watch him. Here he goes. I mean, that's pretty quick. Yeah, I can stop it now. But do you see what he did? As he passed it over, he doesn't go, okay, job done, see you later, guys, I'm off now, gonna get a bacon sandwich. He passes it on, and after he's passed it, he's going, go on, keep going. That's what we're meant to do. Our Christian lives are a relay race. You pass it on. Your job's not done there. You've got to keep going. Keep telling them about who God is. Keep shouting from the next, from where you are. Shout encouragement to the next generation. Each generation commends its works to the next. We're called to pass it on. What happened in the story of Joshua is best summed up in this picture here. That's it. It's a personal sprint. That's what we're doing. And as a result, a generation grew up who neither knew the Lord nor what he'd done for Israel. That's what we read, and it's tragic. But do you know what's even more tragic? You could cut and paste that sentence into 21st century Britain. 75% of 18 to 25-year-olds say they're not religious at all, have no faith. 95% of children and young people have no connection to a church in the UK. There's a generation growing up that neither know the Lord nor what he's done, and that's the reality of what's happening around us. And it's easy to kind of tut from the sideline about some of the choices they're making and the things they're doing and go, look what they're doing with their lives. But we've got to take some responsibility for them. The Apostle Paul, he once writes that everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. It's an amazing statement. Everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. God's heart is for the next generation. But then Paul goes on and he says, but how then can they call on the one that they don't believe in? And how do they believe in the one that they've never heard of? And how can they hear without someone telling them? Each generation has a responsibility to pass on the things of God to the next. It's not meant to be a throw. It's meant to be a pass. It's not meant to be unintentional. It's meant to be, we hand it on until we're sure they've got it. Now, how do we do that? I want to give you 3 very practical ways before we finish. Okay, 3 practical ways about how to pass it on to the next generation. You know, the first way, you can pass the things of God onto the next generation through praying for the next generation. Now, you really can. You know, I'm very aware that part of the reason why I enjoy who God is, that I've seen who God is, that I'm walking with God, is because of my grandparents and my parents' prayers for me. I'm acutely aware of that, and I'm so grateful for that. You can pass on the things of God to the next generation through prayer. So if you're in your 80s, pray for those in their 50s. And if you're in your 50s, pray for those in their 30s. If you're in your 30s, you know, pray for those who are teens. If you're a teenager, pray for babies that are just popping out of the womb. You know, just pray for the next generation. But it's not just about praying for them at arm's length. The next way, the second point about how you can pass it on to the next generation, now this is like really complicated stuff if you want to write this down. The next way is to actually spend time with them. You've got to spend time with them. We see that in Paul's life in the New Testament. He's a prime example of passing things on to the next generation. We're told that Paul grabs hold of younger guys like Timothy and Titus, and he doesn't just kind of sit them down and teach them some stuff. He takes them on a journey. You know, spending time with the next generation is time-consuming. You know? And you say, well, I'm too busy. If you're too busy, you just need to clear a few other things out of your diary. Because this is important. So Paul cleared some things out of his diary, and he spent time with people like Timothy and Titus. He passed the baton on to them, and when they'd got hold of it, he kind of released them and told them to those guys are then to go and pass the baton on. That's what he did. It's interesting. There's one occasion where Paul writes to a church, and he says to them, I want you to imitate me, you know. Not just like what I'm saying. I want you to imitate everything about me. You know, what you've seen of me, I'm copying Christ. I want you to imitate me. But then he says a very strange thing to them. He says, I want you to imitate me. That is why I am sending you Timothy. Okay, so you're not actually with the church. No, I want you to imitate me. That's why I'm sending you Timothy. He's like me in every way. There's something about what Paul is, that he has passed on the baton. He's spent time with Timothy. Everything that Timothy is, everything that he's seen of God, he's passed on to him. And he says, if you spend time with him, it's like you're spending time with me. That's the extent of the pass. But after that point, Paul doesn't kind of say, you know, see you later, Timothy, have a nice time. He encourages him constantly from the sidelines. He's constantly shouting at Timothy, going, go on, Timothy. You know, remember, you're not timid. God's filled you with power. Okay? You're a great guy. You're doing really well. Keep going. We're meant to spend time with the next generation. I want to encourage you to look for people. Spend time with people. And you can pass it on. And finally, we can pass it on through giving to the local church. You know, this summer we've got 2 gift days. And a large chunk of that money is going to go towards the work we do with young people. Every week we're seeing about 250 young people in schools and colleges and doing after-school clubs and all that sort of stuff. And we want to resource that. You know, don't hear what I'm not saying. What I'm not saying is just give the church money and then, you know, that's it, you've done your bit. That's not what I'm saying. Do points 1 and 2 really well. But you can also give to the local church so we can start reaching, as a church, a generation that don't know him. God has done amazing things amongst us. And it's good to enjoy those things, to celebrate those things, to remember those things. But we must not settle and get comfy. we must remember that our primary calling as Christians is not a personal sprint to the finish line. It's a relay race to pass it on to the next generation.